3 miles from St. Mark's Square, in the southern lagoon of Venice, there is a small island that tourists are forbidden to set foot on. It has no electricity, no running water, no inhabitants. From a passing boat you can see a crumbling bell tower rising above the trees and the broken windows of an abandoned hospital staring back at you across the water. Local fishermen won't cast their nets near its shores. Ferries don't stop there. And for over 50 years, the Italian government has kept it sealed off, accessible only by special permit that almost no one receives. The island is called Poveglia, and depending on who you ask, it is either the most haunted place in Europe or the site of something arguably worse. A very real history of plague, quarantine and confinement that people have spent 3 centuries trying not to think about. Tonight we're going to look at both versions, the legend and the truth, because on Poveglia the truth is dark enough on its own. The island first appears in the historical record in the year 421, when Roman families fled to the lagoon to escape the barbarian invasions tearing across the mainland. For centuries afterward, Poveglia was actually a success story, a fortified little community of fishermen and salt producers with its own church and its own government. By the year 864, it was a fully inhabited, thriving settlement that lasted nearly 1,000 years. Then, in 1379, war came to the lagoon. During the brutal conflict between Venice and Genoa, the entire population was evacuated and the island was converted into a military position guarding the approach to the city. The people never came back, and from that moment on, Poveglia stopped being a place where people lived and started becoming a place where people were sent. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what Venice was up against. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in the lagoon and killed roughly half the city. Half. And because Venice was one of the busiest trading ports on earth, the plague didn't come once. It came again and again and again, wave after wave, for more than 3 centuries. Out of that nightmare, the Venetians invented something the world still uses today, quarantine. The word itself is Venetian, quarantena, meaning 40 days, the length of time arriving ships and travellers were forced to wait in isolation before being allowed into the city. To enforce it, Venice designated isolation islands in the lagoon called lazarettos, floating holding pens for the sick, the dying, and the merely suspected. Poveglia became part of that machine. In 1776, the island came under the jurisdiction of the Public Health Office and was turned into a checkpoint. Every ship approaching Venice had to stop there for inspection. Then, in 1793, inspectors found active cases of plague aboard incoming vessels. The ships were seized and marooned. The infected were offloaded onto the island, and Poveglia was formally converted into a full quarantine station, a role Napoleon himself later made permanent. Picture what that actually meant for the people sent there. You show a symptom, a fever, a swelling, sometimes nothing more than having stood too close to someone who had one, and you are rowed across the lagoon, away from the Golden City, to a walled island you may never leave. You wait out your 40 days among the sick and the dying, watching the ones who don't make it, carried away for burial in pits, dug into the island itself. The lazaretto system saved Venice, but it did so by concentrating an almost unimaginable amount of suffering onto a few small patches of land, and Poveglia was one of them. The quarantine station operated until 1814, and mass plague graves have already been confirmed and excavated on Poveglia's sister islands, Lazaretto Nuovo and Lazaretto Vecchio, where the remains of thousands of victims have been found. Poveglia itself has never been fully excavated. No one truly knows what's in its soil, and that uncertainty is exactly where the legend begins. Because the version of Poveglia you'll find repeated across the internet goes much, much further. The legend says 160,000 people died on the island. The legend says so many bodies were burned there that half the island's soil is human ash, that the ground itself is made of the dead. And the legend says that when the plague era ended, something even darker took its place. Here's the documented part. In 1922, the island's old buildings were converted into an institution, officially a hospital and long-term care facility, housing the elderly and, according to numerous accounts, psychiatric patients. It operated for 46 years. This was the era when institutional medicine at its worst meant restraints, isolation, crude electroshock, and experimental procedures performed on people who had no ability to refuse, a pattern documented in asylums across Europe including in the Venice Lagoon, where the asylum on nearby San Savolo Island is now literally preserved as a museum of that dark history. On top of that documented foundation, the legend adds its most famous chapter, a doctor who allegedly used the isolated island as his personal laboratory, performing experiments on patients, crude lobotomies with hand tools, torture disguised as treatment, until, driven mad by what he'd done or by the island itself, he fell to his death from the bell tower. Some versions say he jumped, some say he was pushed, and some say that when he hit the ground, he was still alive until a mist rose up from the soil and finished the job. It's one of the most repeated horror stories in Europe, so let's do what this channel does and hold it up to the light, because when historians actually went digging, they found something almost as unsettling as the legend, just in a different way. The Italian Committee for the Investigation of Claims of the Pseudosciences examined the Poveglia story and concluded that the island's modern reputation, the hauntings, the plague pits holding 100,000 bodies, was largely manufactured and traced its explosion in popularity to an American television show, Ghost Adventures, which filmed a now famous episode there in 2009. A Venetian historian told the New York Times that Poveglia was only one of several quarantine islands, and that the number of confirmed plague deaths on Poveglia itself may have been closer to 20, not 160,000. There's no record, not a name, not a date, not a single document of the mad doctor or his bell tower experiments, the most infamous haunted island on Earth may owe its title less to history than to television. But here's the thing, and this is why Poveglia belongs on this channel. Strip away every ghost story, and what remains is still deeply unnerving. The island genuinely was a quarantine station where the infected were deposited and the dead were buried. It genuinely was an institution where society's most vulnerable people were confined for half a century, out of sight of the most beautiful city in the world. The hospital genuinely closed in 1968, and the island genuinely has sat abandoned ever since. Beds, equipment, and records reportedly left to rot where they stood, trees now growing up through the floors. Venetians were calling it the Island of Ghosts long before American cameras ever arrived. And the fishermen avoiding its waters? That's real too. A superstition passed down through generations who understood correctly that whatever the true number was, Poveglia was a place built to receive the dying. Then, in 2014, the story took its strangest modern turn. Italy, drowning in debt, put Poveglia up for auction. A 99-year lease on the world's most infamous forbidden island sold to the highest bidder. The winning bid, about €500,000, came from a businessman named Luigi Brugnaro, who planned to pour 20 million into redeveloping it, and who, in a twist you couldn't script, later became the mayor of Venice. But the state rejected the deal and the island stayed empty. Meanwhile, ordinary Venetians were horrified. Selling Poveglia, one organizer said, would be like Rome selling the Trevi Fountain. More than 4,500 residents banded together, raised nearly €500,000 of their own money, and after an 11-year fight, in 2025, a citizens group finally secured the lease, with a plan to heal the island, turning it into a quiet public park, not for tourists, for Venetians only. One of the group's patrons put it perfectly: the memories of the island are steeped in pain, but we will transform it into a place of joy. So the island that's illegal to visit will perhaps soon open its gates for the first time in half a century. And maybe that's the real ending here. Poveglia was never haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by what we did there. The quarantines, the confinements, the centuries of people sent across the water and forgotten. The scariest thing on that island was always us. And now, the descendants of the city that filled it with suffering are the ones rowing back across the lagoon to finally let the light in. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, because the world's landmarks are hiding stories far darker than fiction. I'll see you in the next one.